You can start anytime.
No. I think CMS
All
can
right.
start.
Welcome, everyone. This Bible study is right before the beginning of the Fall Retreat. We have some people here who came to be in person, and I'm sure there are many of you throughout the diocese and maybe outside the diocese as well. Let's start with a prayer so that Father Stephen can start the class. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread,
and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. Father, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sid.
I'm going to get the snacks, guys, so I'll be back.
Yes, everyone watching from home will be tantalized by our snacks.
Come up close, too, please. Don't be a stranger.
So we'll get started in just a moment here. When we get started, we are going to be picking up at the beginning of Exodus chapter 16. Chapter 16, verse 1. So in terms of where we were last time, chapter 15, we read the Song of the Sea, which is, as we talked about last time, the first biblical ode in our Matin service, our Orthros service. We also then got to spend some time with the Egyptian god Mantu. If you don't know what that means, you can go back and watch the last one on video. And that was the Song of Victory after the crossing of the Red Sea by the Israelites. That was led by Moses and then by his sister Miriam. And so we are coming off sort of a high point in terms of the Israelites have now, not only has God defeated the Egyptian gods and the Egyptian army and brought the Israelites out of Egypt, he's now brought them through the Red Sea. And now, at least from what we've read so far, they would be planning on heading into the land that God had promised to give them. As we're going to see, things are going to start to go awry pretty quickly, but that at least was sort of the presumption. So I think that's probably enough by way of recap. So unless anybody has any other questions or comments, no questions about Mantu. You really have to go watch the previous episode if you want Mantu stuff. We'll go ahead and pick up in Exodus chapter 16, verse 1. Now they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from the land of Egypt. Okay, so they are now making their way through what we now call the Sinai Peninsula. And the desert of Sin is a happenstance, but a not inappropriate happenstance. Right? The sin here of the name is derived from Mount Sinai. But the English word sin, as we'll see, also applies, even though there's no direct etymological relationship. Verse 2, then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron. So this is the first time we've really seen this. It won't be the last at all. Where despite the things that God is doing for Israel, they are not thankful, right? They are not grateful. they are quite the opposite, right? Quite the opposite. And sometimes it seems almost comical when we read it, looking back on it, like you just saw the Red Sea split in half and you walked through on dry ground in the middle and saw like the most powerful army in the world at the time get crushed by your God. There's a pillar of fire leading you through the wilderness, right? You've seen all this stuff happen and you're complaining, right? And now you're upset. But as I've said a lot in this Bible study, the things that are written in Scripture are not written there so we can point at people in the past and point at them and blame them and make fun of how silly they are. They're written for us because the Scriptures are giving us examples, sometimes extreme examples, of things we do ourselves, right? Things we do ourselves. I cannot count the number of times when I have gotten extremely angry and had my day ruined by something really stupid, right? Like I thought I plugged my phone into charge and it didn't charge, right? And it doesn't matter that God gave me another day on this earth, that I'm healthy, that I have my wife who I love, that I'm part of a parish that I love. None of that mattered. My phone didn't charge, right? Day ruined, right? Complaints, right? Why? What? Right? And there's 1,000 other examples of that, right? Where whatever is going on right now overwhelms everything that's happened in my life to that point, everything, right? So this is not just a picture of, man, those late Bronze Age folks didn't get it. This is a picture of us and how we tend to. It doesn't take very long for us to forget the good things God does for us. It doesn't take very long at all. And it also doesn't take very long for us to start complaining to Him, right, when any small thing goes wrong. Anytime I feel at all sick, I am praying about it immediately. Very rarely do I wake up in the morning and feel perfectly healthy and thank God for the fact that I'm perfectly healthy. This is just something we're prone to, right? We're forgetful. If we woke up one morning and everything we didn't thank God for the day before was gone, I think a lot of us would not have a lot of things left. Right? So don't be too quick to just criticize the Israelites. The Israelites are a picture of us and how we function. And here in particular, they're blaming Moses and Aaron. Right? Moses and Aaron, right, are the ones who are leading them. We already saw a little foreglimpse of this. Remember back when Moses and Aaron first came to Egypt and went before Pharaoh and said, Yahweh, the God of Israel, has said, you must let my people go. And then Pharaoh said, I'm not doing anything of the kind. And he sort of doubled down on the hard labor that the Israelites were doing. Remember, the leaders of the Israelites, the elders, came and complained to Moses and Aaron and said, this is your fault. You're making things worse for us. Why don't you just go away, go back into the desert where you came from? Right? You're just causing trouble. So we got a little foretaste of this. Right, we got a little foretaste of this. But Moses and Aaron are here being the targets. And we're also going to see, it's not going to be explicit in this case, but God's going to make it explicit in some future cases, that where God will tell His appointed leader, look, they're not really mad at you, they're mad at me. Right? And this is another thing that is generally true. A lot of people out there are mad at God for various reasons. And if they find someone, it doesn't have to be somebody who's clergy. As clergy, we deal with this. But anyone who's a Christian, anyone who believes in God, right, can very quickly become sort of the target for their anger and their issues and their problems. And this is what happens with Moses and Aaron. But this also, very early on, Moses is going to be held up, and we're going through the life of Moses here. Moses is going to be held up when we get to the end of his life, spoilers. He's going to be held up as sort of the paradigm of a prophet in the Old Testament, and sort of the paradigm of a godly leader in the Old Testament, right? He's going to be sort of held up as this example. And what we're going to continue to find as we read through his life is that even though God appointed him as a leader, and we could say that's a privilege, right? This is something that God is granting to him. It's this grace that he's giving to him. Moses is also not going to have a lot of fun being the leader of Israel, right? Moses being in charge, Moses having, this is a responsibility, right? This is a burden on him, right? That he has to deal with. And it's not issue of, oh good, I'm the boss, I'm in charge, I get to make the decisions, I get, there is none of that, right? It's this burden placed upon him that he has to shoulder, right? And he has to continuously recommit himself to. And he's not going to get, the Torah, right? The Pentateuch is going to give him the credit. Right? The way Christ himself is going to talk about Moses is going to give him the credit. But he's not going to have that in his life. Right? In his life, he's going to be dealing with this kind of thing that we're about to read about all the way through. Right? And so this is a reality, obviously, of the church as well. And again, this isn't just for clergy. Right? Anyone who takes on a leadership position, if you think you're going to take on a leadership position in the church and everyone's going to love you and praise you and give you things and your life is going to be easy and wonderful now and you're going to have all this power, you need to think again. Right? Yeah. You need to think again. This is why we pray for our bishop all the time. Right? Because of the position he's in. So complaint. Now we're going to get some more details about their complaints in verse 3. The children of Israel said to them being Moses and Aaron, would that we had died, smitten by the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and ate bread to the full. For you brought us out into the desert to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Okay. So they say, man, we should have died in Egypt, and we would have been better off. A little bit histrionic, right? little bit of hyperbole, right? But remember, how this is phrased by them is important, right? Because remember, we talked about the Passover. And we talked about in the plagues, but especially with the Passover, that celebrating the Passover, marking the house with the lamb's blood and eating the lamb as a family, this is what made them an Israelite instead of an Egyptian. God said beforehand, I'm going to make a distinction. Right? So if you were descended from Abraham, but you didn't participate in the Passover, you're not an Israelite anymore. Right? And if you were quote unquote ethnically or genetically in our modern terms, they didn't have those concepts, but you were Egyptian or Ethiopian or what have you, right? And you did keep the Passover faithfully, then you're now an Israelite. So they're saying we would have been better off being Egyptians. We would have been better off suffering God's punishments than receiving the blessings he's promised to give us. So this is a pretty severe statement, right? This isn't just like angry teenager saying, I wish I was dead, right? This is a serious statement, right? Of they'd rather be God's enemy than his friend, right? They'd rather be part of the Egyptians. And why? Oh, because we had it so good there. We had all this meat and all the bread we could eat. Now, is that accurate? No, they were slaves. They were under hard labor, right? They had their rations cut. Right? So this also is false, right? And so essentially, they're doing this to make a demand, right? To make a demand. And they're not demanding from Moses and Aaron, like, hey, you know, we're having trouble feeding our families. Can you do something about this so we can have enough food to eat? Right? They're demanding luxury. And as we said, they're speaking to Moses and Aaron. They're speaking to the prophet and soon to be the high priest, right, appointed by God. They're essentially making this demand of God. Right? That God owes them this kind of lifestyle, this kind of luxury, this kind of good life, right? This is something they're owed by God, and they're mad that God isn't giving it to them. Okay. You say, oh, you just brought us out here to die, right, in the desert. Verse 4, then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread out of heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. So it shall be on the 6th day, they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Okay, so without Moses and Aaron having to answer, God comes to Moses and says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you bread from heaven, bread from the sky, right? Heavenly bread. It's going to come. It's going to come every night. Every day they'll go out and gather it up. And then on the 6th day, on Friday, essentially, I will send twice as much so they don't have to go out and get it on the Sabbath. So they'll have it for the Sabbath. But he's going to send this amount, the amount that they need each day. Right? So what is God doing here? God, well, being God, God is within his rights to do anything. But God could have responded very harshly to this, right, from his people. Like, you ungrateful, like, I just did all this for you. I promised to do all this for you in the future. And here you are, right? Demand, what is wrong with you, right? God could have been angry, could have been wrathful. I mean, that's what everybody's always telling us the Old Testament God is like, right? Like, he's just always angry all the time and smiting people, right? But that's not what he does, right? God condescends to them and says, no, I will feed you. But notice he doesn't say, I'm going to give you what you're demanding. He doesn't say, I'm going to give you pots full of meat, and I'm going to give you, bread until your belly is full. He says, I'm going to give you each day what you need. You will have what you need. Right? If, as we're going to see, if they do what he just said. Right? So this isn't completely unconditional. They're going to have to go out and they're going to have to gather every day. And they're going to have to gather 2 days' worth for the Sabbath. Right? And if they try to do something other than that, we're going to see there's going to be consequences for that. They're not going to have what they need every day. So this may have already, in the back of your head, reminded you of a couple of things from the New Testament. One of them is in John 6, where Christ talks about how their forefathers received bread in the wilderness under Moses. And then Christ says, I am the bread of heaven. Right? I am the heavenly bread. I am the bread that came down out of heaven. Right? So he's referring specifically to this. This isn't just a random analogy. Right? He's referring specifically to this. And so when Christ says that, right, he goes on to talk about the Eucharist in John chapter 6 and other things. But by bringing up this particular episode, he's not only talking about himself as providing what they need. But he's talking about how Christ himself in the incarnation represents God condescending to us, right? To the unworthy people, to the ungrateful people, right? God comes to us anyway, right? Christ comes to us, right? To find us and to give us what we need. To have life, to live, to come to know him, right? And so this is why Christ singles out this specific, one of the reasons he singles out this specific story, right, is that condescension. It may also remind you of the Lord's Prayer, which we said to let us in saying right at the beginning, right? Give us this day our daily bread, right? So that resonates with this, right? Why? They got it each day. They got enough for that day. And remember, we pointed out their demand was all-you-can-eat buffet every day, right, of our preferred foods. What they got was what they needed. And so part of what we're praying when we pray that in the Lord's Prayer is not just to ask God to give us what we need, right, but to help us be content with what we need. And not more than what we need, right? Not be pursuing more than what we actually need and trusting in God to continue to have that. So this is God's answer to them, despite their ingratitude and their complaining. It's also where the word here that's translated as complaining of in Greek. It's sometimes translated as grumbling. It's a great word. It's gungsmi, which is like, right? Like the idea is they're out there complaining and grumbling, right? It's sort of a deliberate onomatopoeia in terms of their complaining. So verse 6, then Moses and Aaron said to all the congregation of the children of Israel, at evening you shall know the Lord brought you out of the land of Egypt. So notice they take it back, right, and say, hey, are you guys forgetting something? Right? Like some things that just happened. In the morning you shall see the Lord's glory, for he hears your complaints against God. But what are we that you complain against us? Right? So they point out to them, we know what's going on here, right? You're not just complaining about us to God. You're complaining about and to God. And Moses said, the Lord's glory shall be seen when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and in the morning bread to the full. For the Lord hears your complaints you make against him. But what are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against God. Then Moses spoke to Aaron, say to all the congregation of the children of Israel, come near before God, for he has heard your complaints. Now when Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the children of Israel, they looked toward the desert, and behold, the Lord's glory appeared in the cloud. Okay, so I'll pause there. So notice we mentioned this once before, actually at the PLC when we did the Bible study. This pattern where we see God come in person and speak to Moses, and then Moses goes and speaks on behalf of God to Israel. And as we mentioned last time, and as you can see here, because there's going to be more talking coming up, it isn't just God says something, Moses walks out and robotically repeats exactly what God said to him, right? Now, clearly he's not saying something different either. It's not that God says one thing and Moses goes and says another thing. There's going to be an episode sort of later on and Moses is going to get in trouble for it. But he says, but what does Moses do? He fleshes it out. He applies it, right? He preaches it. This is part of that image, right, of what the leader who God appoints is going to do. I was talking about that. It's not just a question of they receive knowledge from God, therefore they are special, therefore they are the leader, right? but it is their job, it is their task as the leader. So it's Moses' task that is given to him by God to take what God tells him and to apply it and to explain it and to teach it, right, to the people of Israel, right, to explain it so that they will start to hopefully understand, right? And this is the basis for the concept of ministry all the way into the Orthodox Church, right? Sida explains, right, the scriptures to us. He applies the canons of the church and the laws of the church. These things are explained and applied, right? We believe that they come from God, but we don't just let them sit where they are, right? We don't just read the scriptures and then not have a homily where it's explained and applied to the people, right? And so this goes all the way back to Moses, right? This is what Moses' primary task here is to teach and explain. So he's been told by God that God is going to send this bread, and so now Moses is coming and, right, giving this explanation. First of all, saying how quickly you forget that you've started complaining already, right? And saying, look, the glory of the Lord is still with us. This wasn't just something, he hasn't abandoned us. He's still here, right, leading us in the cloud, right, in the wilderness, right? And here is what he is going to do. Verse 11, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So it was that quail came up at evening and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay all around the camp. But when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the desert was a small round substance, white like coriander seed, like frost on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is this? For they did not know what it was. Thus Moses said to them, this is the bread the Lord gives you to eat. Okay, so God comes and speaks to Moses again. Now in this instance, and pretty much only this instance, we'll talk about this more as we go forward, in addition to the manna, there's this quail. There are these dead quail, which doesn't sound super appetizing. You go outside and you find a bunch of dead quail and you decide to eat one. But that's, he sends them quail. Why? He sends them meat. Right? So notice that actually it was actually Moses who mentioned the meat at twilight before God did. Right? This is not Moses testing God or him going past, right? This is Moses giving to the Israelites a sign. Right? So we've talked before about the way signs work in terms of prophecy. In the Old Testament, when a prophecy is given, there's some prophecy, right, about the future. And sometimes it's a prophecy about the future that the people there aren't going to necessarily see in their own lifetime, right? Or if it is, it may be a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. And so God will also say, this will be a sign to you, sometimes explicitly, this other thing will happen, and will happen sooner, will happen immediately. And so when you see the sign happen, you'll know that that everything that has been said is true, right? This will mark it off. So a big example is in Luke chapter 2. The angels appear to the shepherds and tell them that the Messiah has been born in Bethlehem. And they finish up by saying, this will be a sign to you, right? Go over here, you will find a baby, right, swaddled and laying in a manger, laying in an animal food trough. That's not something you see every day, right? So that when the shepherds went and saw the infant Christ, they would know, so true, this is the Messiah. They didn't have to wait for Christ to grow to be 30 years old to go and begin performing miracles. They knew because they saw, right, the sign. So this is the same kind of thing. Israel is clearly having problems trusting God, right? That's what caused this whole episode, right? So why would they believe for sure that the bread was going to show up every day? They wouldn't, right? And so they're given this sign with the quail added that yes, this is going to happen every day. Because again, having quail turn up at night on command, right? This is not a normal thing, right? If I looked at one of you and said, when you leave here and walk out into the parking lot, you're going to find a dead possum, right? You would look at me like, first of all, you're crazy. But secondly, if you then walked outside and there was a dead possum, right? You'd be like, okay, this is, right? Yeah. Okay, maybe a dead possum is a bad example. A dead wolverine. There we go. There's one within 1,000 miles of here. That's, right? Yeah, they're out in the desert, right? So you're not going to find a pile of dead quail. Right? In the desert. So this is given as a sign, right? I'm telling you this strange thing is going to happen tonight. And so when you see it, you'll know that the rest of what I'm telling you, that God is every day going to give you what you need, that's going to happen, right? And so the quail thing, we're going to see the quail thing disappears, and the bread continues. So many of you have read different English versions of the Old Testament, may be familiar with it being called manna. That comes from that, when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is this? That's manna in Hebrew, right? What is it? Because as it says, it's sort of this white, flaky stuff, right, that's on the ground. Moses tells them it's bread. One of the most ironic things when I lived in Texas was there was a company called Manna Donuts. And I always wondered if they'd actually read the story. Like they were saying, when someone looks at their donuts, they go, what is this, right? Like, but that's so that's where that comes from. So verse 16, this is what the Lord has ordered. Let every man gather it for his family, 1 omer according to the head count and number of souls among you. Each one should gather it with those who share your tents. Okay. So he says you're to gather this amount. We don't know exactly what that measure was. One of the problems with doing ancient measurements like that in the Hebrew Bible is that they weren't, on top of everything else, those measures weren't standardized at all, right? So a shekel in one city and a shekel 100 miles away could weigh very different amounts, right? A lot of times it was by order of whoever the king was in the city or whoever was in power sort of said, this is going to be the measure. It's sort of like the origin of, this is 1 foot long. Well, right, depending on the size of your feet, right? Or a horse is so many hands tall, right? Kind of thing in the ancient world. So we don't know exactly how much this is, but this is one day's food worth for a person, right? And of course, the households here, as we've mentioned before, we tend to think of nuclear families. This isn't Israelite husband, wife, and kids. These are big extended families. That's why it says those who share your tents. So this is grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, aunts, uncles, kids, cousins, right? And servants, right? And husbandmen and all of these things, right? Are all in your family unit. So you could collect one day's amount for each person. And again, you see that measurement, though, is Moses is adding specificity, right? He's applying it, right? This is about 1 day's worth. This is how much you gather. Verse 17, then the children of Israel did so and gathered, some more, some less. Right? And this isn't a reference to different sized families. This is giving us a tip-off that while God has answered this particular complaint and problem, maybe the Israelites aren't going to now be totally satisfied. So when they measured it by omers, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Each one gathered according to the need of those sharing the tent with him. So what happens is, even if they were a little bit lazy about it, right, and didn't quite gather it up, it ended up being enough. Right, this is pointing to a miraculous thing. And the people who tried to gather more than they needed ended up with what they needed, right? And nothing left over. Like it miraculously sort of balanced out, right? Verse 19, Moses then said, "Let no one leave any of it till morning." Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses. I know, you're shocked. But some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. So Moses was angry with them. Right? So there are some people who, why is this such a bad thing? Why would you get all angry about it? This isn't just Moses being like, do what I say, right? This is not trusting God. God's going to send you what you need tomorrow. Well, okay, but if I keep a little extra, that won't hurt, right? Just in case maybe it doesn't show up tomorrow, right? So this is demonstrating a lack of trust in God. And so I've had bread that went bad very fast at home, but I've never had anything that was full of worms and stank like a few hours later, overnight, right? So and that being full of worms and stinking is an image, right? It's like an image of their faithlessness, right? It's an image of that, directed at them. Verse 21, thus they gathered it every morning, every man according to his need, and when the sun became hot, it melted. Right? So after they're done gathering, whatever's still out there disappears. Right? So they're learning they're not going to be able to get around this system, right? They're all trying to kind of game, what are the rules? How can I make this work for me? Right? And that's not going to happen with this. They're going to get what they need every day. Period. Verse 22, so it was on the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one, and all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Okay, so the rulers of the congregation, it's a great translation. The word that's translated congregation there in the Greek, from which the Orthodox Study Bible is translated, is ecclesia. It's the word we translate as church in the New Testament. Okay. So that's not a new word in the New Testament. It just really means assembly. So other English translations often translated assembly, sometimes congregation, sometimes assembly, like the assembly of Israel. Right? When the people of Israel gather, that's the assembly of Israel. Right? And so when Christ talks about his ecclesia, his assembly, this isn't some new concept. Sorry to our dispensationalist friends, right? Where all of a sudden this church thing gets invented, right? This is a continuation of the way it's always been, right? And the rulers here is specifically talking about the elders of the people, right? So within a family, right, you have sort of a patriarch who's the head of the family, one of these large family household structures. And you'll have the other sort of older males, right? So like if you have the patriarch, if his brother is still alive, right, he'll be considered an elder, right, within that family. And then these extended families as groups make up clans, right? That's the way it's usually translated in English, as a clan. And the heads of all of those families are then the elders of that clan. Right? And so then those clans make up the 12 tribes, right, of Israel. And the tribes then have sort of the eldest elders, right, from the clan who make up the elders of Israel proper, right? We're going to see a little later on in Moses' story, there's going to be 70 or 72 numbers thing. We'll talk more about that then, of them, right? And then you have Moses. And the word we're translating elder here in the Greek is presbyter. It's the word we translate priest in the New Testament. Right? So what this literally says, if we translated this the way we translate the New Testament, it would be the priests of the church came to Moses. But we translate things differently based on what testament they're in. Right? This is, and I'm pointing this out because notice this structure. Right? The ecclesia, the assembly, right, has at its head Moses. And we've been talking about his leadership role. And then Moses has, consulting with him and going out and ministering what he says, a bunch of presbyters. Right? So again, this kind of structure of a bishop and presbyters is not something that gets invented in the New Testament, is definitely not something that gets invented at the end of the first or beginning of the second century. Right? This is in Exodus. The first time there is an ecclesia, the first time there is an assembly of Israel, the first time there is a congregation, this is how the leadership is structured. Right? This is how the leadership is structured. And it's still going to be that way even in the Gospels. Because what's the leadership structure for religiously, for the Judean people during the Gospels? You have a high priest, and you have the Sanhedrin, which is made up of 70 elders, 70 presbyters. Right? Let me throw in, remember when Christ calls his disciples, he calls 12 disciples, like the 12 tribes of Israel, and then he calls the 70. Right? None of this is new, right? This is the way God's people and the leadership of God's people functions all the way through the scripture for as long as there is God's people. Right? In this sense. So Moses sends these presbyters to go administer what he said, the directive he gave. They come back and tell him, right, that it's been done. Okay. Verse 23, then he said to them, this is the word the Lord has spoken. Tomorrow is the Sabbath, a holy rest to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning. Okay. So they're boiling bread. This is the first mention of pasta in the Bible. So the point here being, right, here's another test of their faithfulness, right? Because every other day, if they tried to keep any overnight, remember, it went horribly bad. But now they're being told, because tomorrow is the Sabbath, eat what you're going to eat today, keep the rest for tomorrow. It's not going to go bad on the Sabbath. Right? So they're being called to trust again. Right? To trust that God has given this means, right, to provide for what they need. Verse 24, so they laid it up till morning as Moses commanded them, but it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. Then Moses said, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none." Now, before I read verse 27, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think the Israelites are going to do? Now, it happened that some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather, but they found none. Right? It showed up every morning like clockwork till God said it wasn't, and then it didn't. Right? Verse 28, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? Behold, for the Lord has given you this day as the Sabbath. Therefore on the sixth day he gives you bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his house. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day.' Thus the people rested on the seventh day." Right? This is probably the easiest commandment in the world. God commands you to do nothing. Right? God literally says, do nothing. Stay home for a day and do nothing. Right? That's why his response. Right? You can't even do nothing when I tell you to do nothing, let alone do what I tell you to do. Right? But now, at least for the moment, right, they get the picture. And we'll talk more about this when we get a little later in Moses' life, where he starts talking more about the Sabbath and about Sabbath, the idea of Sabbath years. Because later on, the Israelites are going to be commanded to let their fields rest for an entire year. To work their fields for 6 years and then let them rest for a year. And what it means to let them rest means not go out and work the field. And they're told not to go out and work the field because the poor, right, the stranger, they're going to be able to come during that year. Right? And what grows is not going to grow because of a farmer going out there and doing his work in the field. What grows there during that year is going to be whatever God causes to grow there for that year. And so God is saying to them in that seventh year, he's going to use, quote unquote, their land, right, which is really his anyway, but their land to feed those who are in need, right? But that's an even more sort of radical example than the 1 day out of the week that shows sort of what the Sabbath is about and that we see here, which is that it's about trusting God to provide. It's about trusting that if we're keeping God's commandments, we're doing what God has called us to do, we're following God, we're following Christ, that God is going to provide for us what we need. That he's not going to abandon us, he's not going to forget about us, he's not going to forsake us. Right? Why is that hard to believe for us? Because of how prone we are to forget him and forsake him and walk away from him. Right? This is a basic thing in human psychology. When we assume something about someone else, we're really telling people what we're actually like. If you're a person who assumes everybody's always talking about you behind your back, it's probably because you're a gossip. Right? And so what makes it hard for us most of the time to trust God is that God hasn't been able to count on us. Right? But the awareness of that, right, being aware of the fact that, yeah, if God depended on me, the world would be in trouble, right? Because I mess up, should cause us to rely on God more, not less. Right? We should see, when we look at our own untrustworthiness, that should make God's trustworthiness stand out more to us. Right? And drive us more, right, to trust in God. But if you think about somebody who lives and feeds their family, feeds their children based on farming, and these aren't like wealthy farmers, right? These are hand to mouth, right? You have a famine, you're in trouble, you might lose a child, you might lose more than one child, you might lose your own life. Telling them, okay, this year, don't go work your field, I'll take care of you, right? That's a big test of trust. And we're going to find out later in the Old Testament, it's a test of trust that Israel completely failed. Israel, either the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom, never kept a single Sabbath year, their entire existence. And we know that because God has Jeremiah tell them that. He says, for 490 years, you lived in the land I brought you to. And you would not trust me. You would not. He said, you owe me 70 years. And so Jeremiah predicted beforehand that Judah would be in exile in Babylon for 70 years. And that's why. That's it. So I'm going to let my land rest. I'm just going to take you out of the picture for those 70 years. And then I'll bring you back. Right? So this is a constant struggle, right? We're being introduced to this here, this first episode. But this is a constant struggle with God's people and God, up to and including us, right? To trust, not rely on our own, right? It's easy to laugh at those people who went out on the Sabbath to try and find food, right? But how quickly do we start to rely on our own devices? Yes, I trust God to provide for me, but if I could just get a little more money in my 401k, I could relax about it and trust him a lot more, right? Like if I just could a little more, a little bit, right? But just in case, I'm going to have this backup, right? And so what God is communicating to Israel is your concern should not be, where am I going to get food tomorrow? Your concern should be, am I faithfully following God? Because if you're faithfully following God, God knows what you need. You remember someone else saying that? Christ says that. Right? Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these other things. So don't worry about what you'll eat and what you'll wear and what you'll, right? God is still trying to teach that to the people in the New Testament. He's still trying to teach it to us. Right? Verse 31. Now the children of Israel called its name manna. That's that manna, right? And it was white like coriander seed, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. So it tasted sweet. Right? This is again God's kindness to them. Right?
Is it a pancake?
No, it was more flaky.
An overcooked pancake.
I read a sort of pseudoscientific trying to explain this thing.
Oh, yeah.
It said that there's a plant in that area that exudes something in the morning. Do you know anything about that? Is that?
Most of those things are nonsense.
I thought it
Yeah.
was. Yeah.
So there was a period of time in the early modern period, in the 17th and 18th centuries, where people did not want to accept the miracles that are in the scriptures, but they weren't comfortable just dismissing the scriptures. And so they came up with these explanations. So there's this great explanation, quoted by, among other people, Thomas Jefferson at one point, of Christ walking on the water. That, he knew about a hidden sandbar
Yeah.
in the Sea of Galilee. And so he walked out on a sandbar, and they just thought he was. Now, once you get to the 19th century, the Germans got a lot more comfortable just saying, no, forget it, right? That never happened, right? They didn't have to come up with sort of, but you get explanations like that. There's a similar one about the burning bush. Oh, well, this bush, if the temperature of the desert got to this point and it had sap on it, it could ignite. If you don't believe the scriptures, don't believe the scriptures, man. Don't waste your time, right? Like, that's trying to come up with these odd explanations, right? Yeah. And so, I mean, even trying to address that seriously, like, how many of those bushes do you think there were? Like, over the course of 40 years, wandering all around the Sinai Peninsula, like, there were just always those bushes around, right? Like, enough to feed thousands of people. still kind of miraculous, even if that right? if that was true. Verse 32, then Moses said, this is the thing the Lord commanded. Fill an omer with the manna to be kept for your generations, so they may see the bread you ate in the desert when the Lord led you out of the land of Egypt. Right? So this is what Moses is saying here is get together one person's worth, and we're going to seal it. This is what ends up in the most holy place in the tabernacle and later the temple. Okay. Now here's where I have to myth bust. Right? Because a lot of people think that there was a bunch of stuff in the Ark of the Covenant. The only thing in the Ark of the Covenant are the tablets that Moses is going to get later. This manna does not go in the Ark of the Covenant. It is put in the holy place with the Ark of the Covenant. Right? With the Ark of the Covenant. And even here we can see that that only makes sense. Because remember, the purpose of keeping this manna is why? So future generations can see it. Right? So when they build the Ark of the Covenant later, they're not going to like bring it out every so often and open it up and show people what's in it. Right? That's not a thing. Right? So this is separate. Right? It's kept in the most holy place. Right? Because already here, we have a concept of an object, a material object, a thing in the world that is holy. Right? That is holy. And that someone would come and see. We might even say venerate. Right? A relic of something that God did in the past. Right? That they're coming to see now. I don't want to belabor this too much. But we have a lot of friends who aren't Orthodox Christians who do not think such things exist. Right? But here is one, right at the core of this, that this is a very material link to the reality of what God has done in the world. We're going to see more examples of this, but this is one, and this is when it's collected. And of course, this is going to be kept for future generations. So we're talking about years, decades, centuries, meaning this isn't going to go bad either. Right? So it going bad is not some natural property of whatever manna is in under 24 hours. It doesn't just have a short shelf life. When it goes bad, that is, as we said, that's a sign, right, of judgment. That's a sign of the lack of trust, right, in God. Verse 33, Moses then said to Aaron, take a golden pot, put one full omer of the manna in it, and lay it up before God to be kept for your generations. Right? So this is the commandment. They put it in a special golden pot. Look, they have golden vessels that they use in the temple. Another aside. Right? And when it says put it before God, right? At this point, we don't have the most holy place yet. We don't have a tabernacle. We don't have. So what does that mean? Well, this is looking forward to that, right? Here's another myth bust. Another thing that was not in the Ark of the Covenant is God. I meet a lot of people who think God like lived inside the Ark of the Covenant. No. Right? God did not live inside the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was his footstool, the footstool of his throne. Right? So the idea was that God was enthroned in the most holy place. That the ark is where his feet were. And so this was the place where you come to interact with God, right? To stand before God. And so if you take something and you put it there in that holy place, you're placing it before God. You're sort of placing it before his throne, right? And once again, since we've been talking about continuity, this is our understanding of the altar in our churches and the high place. Right? This is the place where Christ is enthroned. This is the footstool of his feet. This is the place where we come to stand before him and offer worship, right? And offer the Eucharist to him, right? Is in this place.
Would that have any relation to melting faces off of Nazis? Would that?
No, although that's fun. And I will say this, if Nazis did find the Ark of the Covenant and did manage to get it open without dying from touching it, their faces would melt. I'm going to go out on a limb.
That's right.
Yeah. That's... Verse 34, as the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron laid it up before the testimony to be kept. Thus the children of Israel ate the manna 40 years, until they came to an inhabited land. They ate the manna until they came to the border of Phoenicia. And then now we get told how much an omer is. An omer was the 10th part of 3 measures. So there you go. Now you know exactly how much. Right. It's 1/10 of 3 measures, right? Yeah, it doesn't say what 3 what, yeah. But yeah, like I said, those the measures, right, it's not standardized, right? So they probably had some sort of scoop or object that they called a measure, right? And we don't know exactly how much that was. But so, as we said, there's lots of spoilers here. Right, this is going to happen for 40 years. We're already telegraphing, right? This is going to happen for the full 40 years. We haven't even found out that they're going to wander for 40 years yet, if you're just reading through. But this is going to happen for 40 years, and we're going to see when we get to the end of Deuteronomy and the beginning of Joshua. Later on, when we talk about the death of Moses, there's a point where the manna stops. That's mentioned, right? But so this is part of God's, right, provision all the way through. So we haven't gone as long as we always do, but also I don't think we should start the next chapter yet. So if anybody has any questions or comments. Oh, okay.
If anyone has any questions, just raise your hand so I can bring the microphone to you since we're live streaming this. And those watching online can hear the question. I can start with the online questions.
Sure. Nobody has their hand up, so.
The first one is from Mark. The first question, Father, is heavenly bread versus heavenly poultry.
Are the quail heavenly poultry?
To Papa Stephen, can you please muse on why manna was preserved in the ark but not the quail, since both were provided as heavenly/earthly food? Thank you.
Yeah. So the quail had this function as a sign, right? And a sign related to their grumbling, because they specifically mentioned meat, right? Because you'll notice here that we weren't told they received manna and quail for 40 years, right? And they don't put a dead quail in the the Holy of Holies, right? So that's particularly related to this episode. Right, and as a sign against them. And not all, develop that a little, not all signs are positive. Right, like we talked about the worms and the stink of the bread being a negative sign, right? That this was a sign of judgment, a sign that something's wrong. Right, and God can give those kinds of signs to us too. Right, it's a sign of something wrong. It's a call to repent. Right, it's a call to repent and to get back on track.
There's 2 questions from Joshua here from the YouTube live stream. The first one's related to the Bible study. The other one's not. So I'll let you decide on the second one. If
Okay.
You want to
What's the second one related to? Professional
Saint
wrestling?
John Chrysostom.
Oh, okay. Well, let's say John Chrysostom. We can talk.
Okay. So the first question from Joshua is, I have a lot of dear Catholic friends. They'd probably agree that Moses' role is as a head bishop figure, but then I'd imagine would continue to say this foreshadows the Pope's office. Why would we say this is a stretch or a misunderstanding of his role?
Well, so what that question ultimately is how many bishops are there in the church? Because essentially the power that's given to the papacy in Rome is the power a bishop is supposed to have. And so, I mean, they would probably make that argument, say, see, there's just Moses. There's just there's just the one. But I would point out in response to that there's also only one nation formed by God of God's people in the Old Testament, whereas in the New Testament, the call goes out to all the nations. And so we see already in the pages of the New Testament, right, we see apostles appointing bishops. For example, St. Paul and St. Timothy, right? And by the way, St. Paul doesn't call up St. Peter and say, hey, can you help me consecrate St. Timothy before I send him to Crete? Right? He sends St. Timothy to Crete, and he says, when you get to Crete, I want you to appoint presbyters and deacons in every church. So St. Timothy has some office that allows him to appoint presbyters and deacons, right? And he's given that office by St. Paul, on St. Paul's authority, as a successor to an apostle, right? And he's not the only one, right? So there are bishops, right? And then in the Roman Catholic Church, the term papacy was coined in the 11th century. The idea that the Pope has a different office than a bishop.
Wasn't the word Pope, though, like Papa, basically like Father in...
Yes, yeah, that's
in
why
title? Because the Pope
the
of
Patriarch
Rome-
of Alexandria is also the Pope of
Right.
Alexandria in Egypt.
Because we have
right?
saints that
Yeah,
are the Pope of Rome.
yeah, but the idea of papacy as separate from the episcopacy,
Got it.
that he's not just someone, he's not a bishop who has this important role, but he is something else, right? Above and beyond a bishop. This is an 11th century idea. Now, they have the idea of the development of doctrine and all this, so they can explain that, right? They have their explanations for that. But I don't think, well, and because of their development of doctrine idea, I don't think they think you can get that directly from the scriptures, right? This is something that requires the scriptures plus 1,000 years of reflecting on them in the West, according to them,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah, that would be my response to that.
There's a question in the room. Why don't we pause on the YouTube
Okay.
questions, and we'll go to the room here. Would you mind just saying your first name and then just kind of talking to this mic?
Yes. My first name's Douglas. My question is, as we were reading this text, one of the things that kind of struck a chord as far as related to the Gospels was the issue of the disciples eating on the Sabbath. And I didn't know if there was some sort of allusion.
Picking the grain?
Yeah, picking the grain.
Yeah,
So I didn't know
yeah.
if there was some sort of connection that was going on with what happens here in this chapter that is being played off of when that section happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that, I'll talk about the passage. I don't think that passage is in St. John's Gospel is a direct reference to this. I think it's more referring to the Sabbath regulations generally that we'll talk about a little more later in Exodus. But I think what's important there is what Christ's response is, right? Because people show up complaining about his disciples and him doing things on the Sabbath all the time, right? So you have to kind of, any given one, you have to look at what makes that one different than the other ones, right? And that's the important part. And that one, when Christ responds in St. John's Gospel, he says that his Father is working even to that very day, and that he is working. And when he says that, this is setting up something that St. John is going to conclude when he talks about Christ's crucifixion and death. Especially when you get into that part of St. John's narrative, all of a sudden he starts using all this language from Genesis 1 through 3. And St. John really wants to hammer home this connection that we make liturgically at Pascha of Christ resting on the Sabbath in the tomb, right? And you'll sometimes hear, here's the 7 words that Christ said from the cross, except none of the Gospels say he said 7 things. Right? That's taking them all together, right? And putting them all together. And what St. John focuses on is that the last word in Greek, right, that he records him saying, tetelestai, right? Tetelestai, actually. That Greek word is the word that's used in the Greek of Genesis 2, verse 1. When God finishes creating, it says he finished his work. It's that verb, right? So Christ is saying in that instance, no, God is still working. It's not done yet. The Sabbath, like the Sabbath of Sabbaths, as we call it on Pascha, right, is coming. Right? And so that work is complete when Christ dies, right? Rests in the Sabbath and then rises again.
We have quite a few people watching on our YouTube live stream, and there's another couple questions, but Joshua had a second
Are they
question.
friendly?
They seem friendly. I know a couple
I don't
of
want
them.
mean people.
No, I know a couple of them. So I think the second one,
I don't have my reading glasses and I'm an old man.
can you read that?
Can I?
I wish. I don't know if I can.
Unrelatedly. Okay, there you go.
Let me expand this. So this was the unrelated question about St. John Chrysostom.
Oh, yeah,
This is,
that's really unrelated. To Joshua, if you're still watching, and this will be no consolation to you immediately, I should give him a sign. But I have a journal article on that element of St. John Chrysostom that's going to be published hopefully soon. If you've never published an academic journal article, what you don't know is that they get accepted for publication, and then you wait sometimes years for them to actually publish them, literally. And they don't pay you anything. In fact, now there's a whole racket, especially with European journals, where they want you to pay them to publish your article. But hopefully that will come at some point soon. But short version is, just to really quickly address it really quickly, is that people are taking things that St. John Chrysostom said out of the context in which he said them and reading them as if he said them yesterday on Twitter. Right? Which, of course, is not what he did. Right? So that's the very short version. Okay.
Okay. We can move on to the related questions, if I can get to them. There we go. Okay, the next one is from Derek Waters, my good friend back in Springdale, Arkansas. What would a 10th part of 3 measures mean? 1/10 of a part? Since this has been preserved, are there any connections to the Eucharist? I see the number 3 and can't help myself.
Well, I mean, there's a broad connection to the Eucharist of the heavenly bread, obviously, right? And Christ makes that connection explicitly in John chapter 6. After the part that we talked about where he describes himself as the bread from heaven, he then talks about, for my flesh is food indeed, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, there is no life in you. So Christ explicitly, undeniably makes that connection, right? And if you read any church father talking about, give us this day our daily bread in the Lord's Prayer, they will bring the Eucharist into that as well, right? Because of this close connection. But in terms of the 10th part of 3 measures, right? So there would have been some kind of measuring device, not a measuring cup like we have, but probably something more like a scoop. It was probably made out of some kind of woven something, right? And when you went to buy grain, right, you would buy a certain number of measures. The price would be per measure. You'd buy a certain number of measures that would be essentially like scoops, right? So the 10th part of 3 measures would be you take 3 scoops, right, like you put them in a pile, and then you take a 10th of that, right, a 10th of that, which again does not help us figure out exactly how much an omer was, but right, but that's what it's describing. Yeah,
It's like a foot. How big's the foot, right?
exactly. Yeah, it depends on how big you are. Yeah.
We have another question on the YouTube live stream chat, but is there a question in the room that here, let's.
Yes, sir.
Go to the back
Oh,
of
wait,
the room.
wait for the mic.
1 second. If you could just kind of keep that somewhat close.
My name is Hank. Is the assignment to the Israelites to go out each day and pick up the bread similar to the assignment when they're bitten by snakes to actually go and look at the bronze serpent on the pole, and that you have to do something to
Yeah. Yeah.
in order to be faithful?
Yeah. Short version is yes. Right. But this is important because we've talked this Bible study, and I've talked a bunch of other places. The thing that we usually the word that we usually translate as faith in most English Bibles, the New Testament, like when St. Paul uses it. And we read the word faith and we think like, oh, you intellectually believe, like you say, yes, that's true, like on a true false test, right? St. James, if you read his epistle, points out that's not what it is, right? Because the demons would pass the true false test. They get a perfect score, right? But they don't have faith, right? That's what St. James says. But it's more like faithfulness, loyalty, trust, right? Faithfulness. And faithfulness, you can't sort of take apart. Some of our, well, not some, all of our Protestant friends try to take apart. Well, you have faith, you have beliefs over here, and then you have works, things you do over here. Like they're these two separatable, unrelated things, which again is what St. James is arguing against in his epistle. But the reality is faithfulness obviously includes both. Right? Faithfulness includes both. And this is why, the fancy theological word for this, like the Fathers, is synergy. Right? So, and synergy, God works and we work. This isn't because God needs us. Right? God didn't need the Israelites. So this is a perfect example of it. God didn't need the Israelites. Right? So if they decided, you know what, I'm not going to go get the manna today, that's not causing a problem for God. That's causing a problem for them not having any food. Right? So God gives, God offers, and so this extends to salvation, right? God has provided for our salvation. He offers it to us, right? But that doesn't mean we just say, oh, okay, it's taken care of. Right? We need to, right, then be faithful to God, right, to receive those things. We talked about, before we got into Moses, we did the life of Abraham. When God comes to Abraham in Ur and says, I'm going to give you this land on the other side of the known world, Abraham doesn't just sit there in Ur and be like, okay, yeah, I believe you. Right? And therefore, because I believe you, I get the land. Cool. Right? He has to get up, take his whole family, take all his flocks and herds, travel for literal years to get to the other side of the known world.
It's a lot of
Right?
action.
Yeah, right. He does all of this, right? That doesn't mean that by doing all that, Abraham earned something. He didn't earn anything. The Israelites didn't earn their food by going out and picking it up off the ground. Right? But obviously, if they didn't go pick it up off the ground, they weren't going to get to eat it because it was going to disappear in the sunlight later in the day. Right? So this doesn't have to be as complicated as it becomes in theological debates with our non-Orthodox Christian friends. Right? This is actually pretty straightforward. There's countless examples of this all through the Bible.
Putting faith against works, it's really a false dichotomy.
Right, right.
Because the works is a result.
And that's why St. James says, I will show you my faithfulness by what I do. You will look at what I do and how I live, and you will see that this is a person who's trying to follow God. Doesn't mean he's going to do it perfectly, right? But he was trying to follow God, trying to stay faithful to Christ.
I'll go back to a question from our YouTube live stream. I'll come right back to you after that. Quick question from Seth Wilson. Seth, another friend of mine. Given your point earlier about trusting God instead of putting our plans first, would that mean the old saying, quote, heaven help those who help themselves, unquote, is putting the cart before the horse?
Yes.
That's a quick answer.
And Rene Descartes was trampled by a horse.
Oh.
That's how he died. So you should never put Descartes before the horse.
Thank you for that. So Seth, hopefully that was a good enough answer. I know it gave us a laugh in the room.
Yeah.
Let me go to the back of the room for the next question. If you wouldn't mind sharing your first name.
My name is Jake. My question is, so a story like this from the Old Testament to us, in many ways, is not reduced, but serves as a parable, in that it's removed by centuries, cultures. But at the time of Christ, would this have been more history, more parable? Like, he spoke in parables so people could understand. So did it become, he provided the context after the fact for history they knew? Or can you speak to that at all?
Yeah. I don't think it's an either or. Right? I don't think it's an either or. I think the understanding of they had a very different understanding of history than we do, because we're living post-19th century Germans, right? Where 19th century Germany, history, I'm looking at you, George William Frederick Hegel, right? History becomes Wissenschaft, it becomes a science, right? And you apply these scientific methods. This is why, one of the many reasons why it's so annoying to try and have a conversation with an atheist on the internet, because they'll be like, oh, show me evidence, that God exists, scientific evidence that God exists, or scientific evidence that Jesus did this or that historically 2,000 years ago, right? Which is just this weird category mistake, right? So they didn't have that concept of history. They didn't have, the video camera did not exist. So they did not even have the concept of, well, if I went back in time in a time machine with a video camera, what would I see, right? We can ask that question because we know what a video camera in a time machine is, right? But they didn't think that way, right? So when they're talking about history, they're talking about this is what God has done in the past for us because there was a sense of solidarity between them and their forefathers, right? And there should be for us too, by the way. This is why we're always saying, blessed art thou, O Lord, the God of our fathers, right? And it doesn't matter if your grandpa or even your dad was not a Christian, right? That's not the fathers and forefathers we're talking about, right? They had this connection. So this is what God has done for us, right? And what makes what God has done for us, because God did a lot of things, right? You couldn't list them all, right? But some of them are remembered and are preserved in Historia, right? The stories are preserved because those things that God did present a pattern to us, right? And that's why we see these patterns that repeat, that are reiterated, right? This pattern of how God relates to us as people. Right? And so Christ can then look at the people and say, God fed your forefathers. Remember this, right? God fed your forefathers. Manna in the wilderness, right? And then he can present himself not only as in keeping with that pattern, but this is what we mean when we say that Christ fulfills the scripture. The word that's translated as fulfill in Greek means very literally fulfill, fill full, like fill up, right? Fill up to overflowing. So that pattern of God providing for his people, of God condescending to his people, that we get an outline of here in this story that we heard today, that is fulfilled, it is filled full by Christ, filled up to overflowing, right? Such that that pattern should point us to Christ. That's why Christ could say, hey, if you knew Moses, if you had really read and understood this, you'd see it was talking about Christ. Right? You'd see that's who it was talking about. That's who it's describing. That's the outline that you're being given. Right? Christ fills that in. Right? So I don't think it's an either or. Right? What makes it history, what makes it something that needs to be preserved, is that it's telling us something that is always true, the way a parable does. Right? It's giving us a truth that is transhistorical ultimately, that isn't limited to a particular time and place. It's true. Right?
Any last minute questions for Father Stephen?
Anything you need to straighten me out about, Sid?
There's-
Okay.
There's a quick question from Seth, follow-up. Speaking of biblical patterns, is Jordan's Through New Eyes worth reading?
I will say yes to worth reading. That is not an endorsement of any or all of his conclusions. But it is a book that is worth reading. There are other books that are not worth reading, but yeah.
And then Derek's trying to poke the bear here. He's saying date of Exodus, question mark?
Yeah.
I think he's poking you here.
1942 AD.
1942,
Yeah,
during World War II.
yeah. That's why people were all distracted
Oh, okay.
by World War II, and so they didn't notice Israel leaving Egypt.
That's an interesting theory.
Yeah.
Did you see that on the History Channel?
No, on the History Channel it involved aliens.
Oh, that's
That's
right.
the-
That's right. Derek said he knew it, so. All right, we are right at about the time we usually end these Bible studies. Since it looks like all the questions are done, we don't have any more in the YouTube live stream. I just want to thank you again, Father Stephen, for doing this in person.
my pleasure.
Thank you, Father Gabriel, for allowing us to do this here at St. Elias Church on the eve of the beginning of the Fall Retreat here at St. Elias Church.
And shout out, thank you, Dr. Arthur White, for getting up very early in the morning
Hey.
so I could get here in time.
Yeah, it took my group 4 a.m. when we left, so, and I barely made it. And Sayed, of course, thank you all, as always, for being here and for your blessing to continue these wonderful Bible studies. Do you have any closing words, or would you like to close in prayer? Okay,
Okay.
I think we're good then.
Christ our God, watch over your servants, guide and protect them, and bring us back together at the appointed time to glorify thy holy name, of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Please bring some snacks with you, especially if you're staying at the hotel. They're hard to come by, so grab a plate, take something with you if you would like. Thank you all for being here. If you're here for the Fall Retreat and from out of town, welcome to Atlanta. Thank you for choosing to spend your first evening with us here. And we'll see you tomorrow, bright and early.
Lord
Good
willing.
night.
It'll be early. I might not be that bright. I don't know.
For the 4 a.m. group.
You're a better man than I could be.